Start with Democrats in Congress ramping up the pressure with probes into Trump's taxes and business dealings. Today, the president's lawyers told the Treasury Department that his taxes should not be released to Congress, and Trump himself claimed the law was on his side.
Oh, I don't know. That's up to whoever handles it. I don't know. Hey, I'm under audit, but that's up to whoever it is. From what I understand, the law is 100% on my side.
So obviously Democrats in Congress don't agree with that, but in any legal fight, they're going to face Trump allies in key positions at the IRS. The New York Times reporting that the top lawyer at the IRS has ties to the Trump organization, that putting him in place was a key priority for the president. The probe into Trump's finances extending beyond his taxes, though. His accounting firm reportedly will give 10 years of Trump documents to Congress once they do get a subpoena. And the Capital One Bank also saying they'll hand over Trump documents as well. This is all veering into territory that Trump once said was a red line for him.
Mueller was looking at your finances, your family's finances, unrelated to Russia. Is that a red line?
Would that be a breach of what his actual...
I would say yes. Yeah, I would say yes.
All right, joining me now is Elie Mystal, executive editor of Above the Law. Christine Quinn, vice chair of the New York State Democratic Party and former New York Council Speaker, and Howard Fineman, an MSNBC news analyst. Howard, I'm going to start with you on this one. Trump starting the week out saying that he was exonerated from the Mueller probe altogether because of the Bill Barr letter, as we well know, 4 pages, which actually turned out to summarize 300-plus pages. Still waiting on that one. Now it seems as if the president has tried to hide his finances. What has happened here?
Well, I think it's clear that the 4-page letter from Barr didn't do what it probably was intended to do, which is to open and close the case. Far from it. I talked to one of the key leaders on the Democratic side in the House right after the Barr letter came out, and they said it was going to be full steam ahead with the investigative and oversight committees that the Democrats control in the House. And you've got 5 of them going after different parts of the Trump story. The point here is that, impeachment aside, the American people in the Congress need to know, in essence, financially and business-wise, who Donald Trump is. We still really don't know. That's key to understanding foreign influence, if any. It's key to understanding illegal contributions, perhaps. It's key to understanding his business and so forth. And a full portrait of Donald Trump is going to come out one way or the other. At least that's what the House leadership intends to have happen. And that is the tone of things right now as we end the week, 10 days or so after the Barr letter.
Elie, if we were having this conversation a year or so ago, we would assume that Bob Mueller had Donald Trump's taxes in his hand. He knew the finances, because if he was looking into Russian collusion or alleged Russian collusion, or if he was looking into if there were any ties between the Trump organization and Russia, Moscow, Vladimir Putin, he would be looking if there was any money exchanges there, if he had any business interests in Moscow. We cannot assume now that Mueller had any access to Trump's taxes or his finances.
Exactly. But the House House Ways and Means Committee is going to get access. When Trump says that the law is 100% on his side, he is 100% wrong. As Jules from Inglewood might say, nobody asked Donald Trump a thing. All right? This is not his call. It is Steve Mnuchin's call. The law is very clear here. It says that the Treasury Secretary will furnish tax returns of any American citizen upon written requests from House Ways and Means. So nobody really cares what the Trump lawyers have to say about it.
Go ahead, Christine.
And you know, Mnuchin can try to disregard that. He could read it differently, as they seem to read many things differently, like the Constitution in the White House. But at the end of the day, that is a case when taken to court by the House Democrats, they will win. Because you're right, it is clearly stated in the law. It's not interpretable.
Well, let me just get down to the nuts and bolts of this. So it's based on this 1924 law, from what I understand, right, Elie? And I know that you have this on your phone, this tax law ready to go. And tax laws are very difficult to understand, from what I understand. Yeah. Okay, so it's based on this 1924 law. So anybody could see in Congress could see my taxes if they wanted to see it, right? So now you're saying the decision goes to Steve Mnuchin. It's going to go to the Treasury Department to actually make clear if whether or not we can see the president's taxes. Why would Steve Am I wrong?
Yeah, because it's not that Steve Mnuchin has the authority to make it clear for us to see it. Steve Mnuchin has
For Congress
has
to
the
see
responsibility for Congress to
But
see
why
it.
would Steve Mnuchin agree to this?
Why wouldn't he? It's right in the law. Like, he doesn't have a
But he's a Trump appointee. Why would he agree to this?
he could be held in contempt of Congress if he doesn't follow the law. I mean, they could literally go over to his office and arrest him if he doesn't follow the law. The law couldn't, as complicated as tax laws are, this one is very clear. Upon written request from the chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, the chairman shall furnish such a committee with any return or return information specified upon request. That's as clear as it gets.
Yeah, go ahead, Howard. Go ahead.
I was going to say that law sounds very antique. It's from 1924, but if it gets to the court, the legislative history will be important. And the history is that grew out of the famous or infamous Teapot Dome scandal in the early 20s that involved the administration at that time. So there's an argument to be made that far from it violating executive privilege, the law itself grew out of a at least superficially analogous situation a century ago.
Okay, so we know, and we've heard from the president over and over again, the reason why he has not released his taxes as of yet, and he doesn't want to, is because he has been continuously audited for a decade. Not necessarily sure who was audited for a decade, but he says he has been audited for a decade or so. I want to play you guys a soundbite from the president talking about his audit, and then we're going to follow it up with something that Charles Reddick had to say, Trump's IRS commissioner. Let's watch.
You don't release your returns until the audit's complete. When the audit's complete, I'll do it.
They're under audit. They have been for a long time. They're extremely complex. Nobody turns over a return when it's under audit. When the audit's complete, I'll release them. I'm not releasing the tax returns because, as you know, they're under audit.
So are they not under audit? Here's what Charles Reddick had to say, Trump's IRS commissioner. He said this: would any experienced tax lawyer representing Trump in an IRS audit advise him to publicly release his tax returns during the audit? Absolutely not. Ellie.
Okay, so A, he's lying. He's probably not under audit.
Why do you say that?
Michael Cohen has said that as far as he knows, Donald Trump's taxes are not under audit.
And it's the longest audit in the history of Christendom if he's actually still under audit.
Right. So A, he's lying. B, he's lying some more because he's certainly not under audit for the taxes that he filed while he was president, right?
Correct.
C, if you listen to what the IRS guy is saying, he's talking about it in a theoretical sense. If somebody was under audit, you wouldn't be advised to release your taxes. Not Trump is under audit, and I am advising him not to release his taxes. And D, and again, this is an important point, nobody's asking Trump to release his taxes. Nobody cares what Trump thinks about his taxes. Nobody's asking him to release them publicly. We're simply asking to follow the law and to provide. The government is asking the government to look at information that the government has already collected.
Christine, hold on. I want to play what Michael Cohen did have to say in that testimony, in which Ellie just referred to, and then I want you to weigh in. Go ahead, guys.
What he didn't want was to have an entire group of think tanks that are tax experts run through his tax return and start ripping it to pieces, and then he'll end up in an audit and he'll ultimately have taxable consequences, penalties, and so on. I presume that he's not under audit.
And then he'll end up in an audit, and then he said, I presume that he's actually not under audit.
And he would know. He would know, if he was under audit. B, he probably was in the room when they had conversations about how are we going to get around presidential candidates releasing their 10 years of taxes. So if there is somebody who knew, he's the guy. There's really little question about that.
Make another point here?
You certainly can, Howard. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say you got to step back just a little bit. The habit of presidents releasing their tax returns go back to Richard Nixon, and it's been true every time since. But the thing about Donald Trump, as we've already been saying, we don't know who he is really until we know who he is financially. This is the first person of this kind to ever be elected president of the United States. A guy with a global and local big business who on paper is worth billions of dollars. We don't know who the president is in a real sense until we know his financial profile. One way or another, we've got to get it, I think, and that's what the House Democrats are trying to do with the accounting records, with the tax records, with the what's in your wallet request to Capital One. I mean, that's what they got to get.
We are not endorsed by Capital One.
No, I know. I understand.
I got to put that out there. I'm going to have legal calling me at any moment.
Okay.
Howard, what is Congress going to do with these taxes if they do get a hold of them?
Well, if they do get a hold of them, their first challenge will be to keep them under lock and key, which they've got to do if they do it.
That's
number
critical.
one.
If they
Yes,
mess
It
that
is
up,
absolutely critical, because if it leaks, then ball game
Yep.
as far as Trump's
Yep.
concerned politically. But then they've got to use that as part of the picture, as I say, with the work product of the accountant, with the bank records, with the flow of money. The question here is there may not be a criminal conspiracy. There may not be a criminal conspiracy to collude or cover up. But we have to know what influences there are that make this president make the decisions that he makes. And that's really what we're after here. And also, for the sake of history, we have to know whether impeachment is ever involved or not.
And I think
Go ahead.
he's absolutely right. Absolutely right. That's the fuller sense of who the president and the people around him are. Right. We don't know what's in Mueller's report, but we do know it looked at Russia, and it probably looked at investments that the Trump organization or Trump has had. That we need to know, because that has influence. Maybe we can't say it's necessarily criminal influence, but it has an influence just of him as a person, and we need to know that.
I just quickly want to ask you this, because I do have to wrap, Christine, but you have been in New York City politics for quite some time, in New York politics for quite some time. If you are a New Yorker, you have known Donald Trump for a very long time. What could he, or what do you think he is hiding? Why does he not want to show his taxes?
He was a phony baloney developer. He never really developed much in this town. He just sold his name to things. He doesn't want people to know that the emperor has no real estate clothes on.
Fake billionaire.
Fake billionaire.
He's a fake
billionaire.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.